Once again, I am unsure of the order of the route of march, but the next city that makes sense is Brussels, Belgium. Dad had been here on buying trips for Bambergers, the New Jersey division of Macy's, but this was all new to Mom. As you can see in this picture, the atomium, left over from the Brussels World's Fair, was still standing. In fact, it is the only evidence of the 1958 event in Heysel Exposition Park left standing today. This representation of a crystal of iron caught Dad's eye, just like the Trilon Imperisphere of the New York's World's Fair of 1939 did. As you know from the earlier chapters in this narrative, Dad was caught up in the world of the future. I am quite sure he dragged Mom out to see this fairground when she would rather spend time at the Grand Place. And speaking of the Grand Place, here is a shot of same. It was hard for me to know exactly what they did here, but when we were here, it was off to Lyons for mussels. The restaurant is located just behind Dad's left shoulder. You cannot see it because Dad is taking the photograph. Mussels baked with cheese, or moules au gratin, as it is written on the menu, is perhaps the best seafood dish I have ever had. We have made this dish at home, and while it is not the same, it is pretty darn close. The picture of Mom here displayed reflects the summer view of the Grand Place. We came at Christmas time in 1979, and there was a live nativity set up right here. The next country that was visited was Denmark. Nyhavn is the waterfront section of Copenhagen. In the 17th century, this was the center of all port activities. Over the next 300 years, this section of town suffered from all of the ills and vices that any working port expressed. Now, however, it has been restored to its 1650s roots and is devoted to the tourist trade. In 1965, when I was touring Denmark, I stayed with a retired sea captain as part of the Meet the Danes program. His home was a modest apartment in Nyhavn. While the folks were wandering the port area, Dad snapped this shot of the Little Mermaid. This image is quite easy to take as the statue is just a stone's throw from shore. This small figure was from the Tales of Hans Christian Andersen. Although the folks went to the author's home in Odense, Denmark, the picture there did not make the cut for this narrative. As I have explained before, Dad's slide collection numbered over 10,000 slides at his death. Some culling just had to be done. The folks loved seafood, and I am sure that they had plenty of it here. If you are in Denmark, and that is your thing too, you are in high clover. Everything from small, open-faced sandwiches to a full multi-course repast is available, featuring almost everything that can be harvested from the sea. The last stop on the 1961 trip was Vienna, Austria. This picture shows the Royal Habsburg coach of state. It is on display at the magnificent Schönbrunn Palace. Buildings on this site go back to the early Middle Ages. The palace that you see today was mostly the work of Maria Theresa in the middle of the 18th century. It is interesting to note that the same year of the folks' visit, the site had another set of famous visitors. John F. Kennedy met Nikita Khrushchev there in early June. It is my guess that the June date on the slides means that the folks were back home at this time. As a small note, Mother raved about the pastries covered with heavy whipped cream, or Mitschlag, as the locals say, for years afterwards. This narrative becomes even more difficult for me now. In the early spring of 1962, Mom and Dad joined 3 other couples for a trip to Iberia. This is hard for me because I have never been to Spain and Portugal, so I cannot flesh out these stories with tales of my own travels. By this time, I was in the middle of my freshman year at Syracuse University, so I was not at home when the folks returned. Thus, there is only one story that made the rounds, and I will relate that one during the description of Barcelona. First stop was Madrid. As you can see in this image, we are in the heart of the hotel district. This shot of a small plaza reminds me of London or Paris. While the folks were not big art fans, I am sure that they spent time at the El Prado Museum. This famous home of world-class paintings fashions itself as the largest art gallery in the world. The statue of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza is in the Plaza de España in downtown Madrid. The sculpture was Lorenzo Valera. Most of the monument was built between 1925 and 1930. It was finished between 1956 and 1957 by the son of the original sculptor. While I cannot be certain, I can guess that this picture was taken by Dad during a walking tour of the city. When I travel, I always reserve time for just walking around. I conclude that this is the case, as the statue is not standing outside of any famous building, but is just in a small park. Google Earth makes writing this description oh so much easier. It is not clear if Barcelona was the next stop or not, but this is a good point to tell the story of the folks' traveling companions. I do not remember all of the names, but here is the supporting cast. Jean and Harold Schwartz were best friends. In fact, Dad and Harold were schoolmates in Plainfield, New Jersey. The folks would take other trips with Jean and Harold. Saul Nadorf was our family doctor. I do not remember Saul's wife's name. The last couple was named Carreri, although I am not sure of the spelling of the name or the first names of either one of them. Since Mr. Carreri figures into the following anecdote, we will just refer to him as such. Back then, and maybe still today, you could put your shoes outside your hotel room door in the evening, and they would be returned to you in that same position, shined, in the morning. It seems that all of the men in the group did just that. When the four couples met for breakfast the next morning, Saul Nadorf explained to the group that as he walked into the dining room, he discovered that the shoes he had on were not his. At this point, Mr. Carreri exclaimed rather loudly, "How could you walk around in someone else's shoes?" Then the 8 of them finished breakfast. The 4 couples returned to their rooms in 2 elevators. The Nadorfs and the Carreris rode in 1 elevator, the Schwartzes and the Schuldenfreis in a second. When they all got to the room floor, the Nadorfs and the Carreris emerged from their elevators, doubled over with laughter. It was discovered that the same Mr. Carreri, who had mocked Saul for not knowing that he was wearing someone else's shoes, was himself wearing someone else's shoes. He had on Dr. Nadorf's shoes. It turns out that back in the early 1960s, Portugal was the bargain destination of Europe. While also true today, Lisbon was not quite as famous for being off the beaten path as it once was. When the intrepid band of Plainfield explorers reached this ancient land, they were the first of their circle of friends to do so. I have lots of images of Portugal, but alas, no stories. As this scene shows, the country adheres to the old ways of life out of necessity of poverty and not to be quaint. These fishmongers are eking out a very basic living. This is not the museum rustic way of life that the folks saw in Marken, Holland, but a very real way of life in this poor country. The final location I wish to relate in this early 1960s travelogue is a side trip to the island of Majorca. Normally, one goes here to relax on the beautiful beaches, but you can tell by the gentleman wearing an overcoat in this picture it was cold. Majorca claims to be the #1 destination for holiday traveling Europeans, a point that the islanders exclaim without providing data as proof. It is clear that the beaches are the reason why, so it is unclear to me why the folks went there during the cold months. While there are churches to visit and even a museum or two, this is not the epicenter of Iberian culture. So I guess the folks went here for a little downtime and not much else. Like national politics, the early 1960s were fairly quiet. And so it is a fitting end to this chapter. The second half of the 1960s was quite another story for the country and for our family.